The sun spilled across the balcony in Elafonissi, painting the water in streaks of turquoise and pink, when my phone lit up with a red banner across the top. Sophia and Jason's wedding is live now. I wasn't supposed to see it. I wasn't supposed to be there at all. My family had made that painfully clear weeks ago when my mother's voice cut through the phone like a blade. If you can't support your sister, then don't come. I had been erased again. They laughed when I warned them about Jason, said I was being dramatic, jealous even. And now here it was, the wedding I had been pushed out of, streaming across my screen like some cruel reality show. Daniel leaned on the railing beside me, the Aegean breeze ruffling his dark hair. "You don't have to watch," he said softly. But my thumb hovered anyway, because it wasn't just a wedding, it was proof. Proof that they had chosen him over me. Lies over truth, fantasy over blood. And part of me wanted to see if my silence, my absence, would matter when the curtain finally tore. I had been in Elafonissi only 2 days yet. It felt like I had stepped into another life. The villa overlooked pink sand and shallow waters that stretched farther than my eyes could follow. Daniel had insisted we come here when the guest list for Sophia's wedding was finalized without my name. "Let them have their circus," he'd told me. "We'll have the sea." At first I resisted. How could I run off to Crete while my entire family gathered back in Texas, raising glasses and smiling into cameras as if their betrayal weren't carved into my skin? But the moment we landed with the Mediterranean sun wrapping itself around my shoulders, I realized leaving wasn't cowardice. It was survival. My name is Olivia Hart, and I am 32 years old. For most of my life, I played the role of the strong one, the reliable daughter, the sister who showed up no matter how uninvited she felt. I co-founded a marketing agency in Denver, one that nearly crumbled twice, because I was wiring money to Sophia instead of paying my own rent. When she wanted to move across the country, I drove the truck. When she maxed out her cards, I paid her bills. And when she called crying after Jason's first bad night out, it was me who sat on her bathroom floor, holding her hand, whispering that she deserved better. And now I wasn't even worthy of a seat in the back row. The pattern had been there my whole life. At Christmas dinner, I was the one stuck clearing dishes while my parents praised Sophia for her new internship. On my 30th birthday, not one family member called. Yet, when Sophia got engaged, they threw a party with sparklers, and a 3-tier cake plastered every photo across Facebook, tagged me only so it would look like I was part of the celebration, even though no one asked if I could come. Favoritism wasn't hidden in my family. It was paraded like a tradition. So when I stumbled across Jason's name buried in a court filing an obscure document linked to a shell company in Miami, I did what any responsible sister would do. I dug. I traced names, addresses, dead phone numbers. I found empty offices, tax records, financial patterns that screamed money laundering. A friend of mine from law school looked over the documents and said quietly, "This isn't just fraud, this is trafficking territory." My stomach turned cold. I called my parents immediately. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "Jason isn't who you think he is. There's proof. He's dangerous." My father chuckled on the other end. "Liv, you've always had such an imagination. Try to be happy for your sister for once." Then came my mother's sharp sigh. "If you keep this up, you'll ruin her day. Don't make this about you." Those words, "don't make this about you," had been the refrain of my life. Every time I cried because Sophia broke my tablet on my 13th birthday. Every time I asked why my acceptance to UCLA was less important than Sophia's breakup, every time I wanted to be seen, I was told the same thing: "Don't make it about you." But how could I not? How could I stand silent when the man she was marrying was about to pull her and all of them into ruin? When I told Sophia directly, her voice cracked on the phone. "Why are you doing this to me, Olivia? You've always hated when I was happy." "I'm trying to protect you," I said. "Jason is not safe." But then she switched as if flipping a switch rehearsed 1,000 times. "You just can't stand that he chose me, that Mom and Dad are finally proud. Stay away from my wedding." And then the line went dead. So I stayed away, but staying away didn't mean I stopped caring. Watching that red banner flash across my phone, knowing my entire family sat in rows of white chairs beneath chandeliers strung in the Texas sun, I couldn't help but feel that familiar hole of exclusion yawning open in my chest. They were all there, childhood friends, cousins, even Rachel Miller, a sorority sister Sophia hadn't spoken to in years. 152 names on that list, and not mine. Daniel handed me a glass of cold wine condensation, dripping down the stem. "You don't need to punish yourself," he said gently. "Their choices aren't your burden anymore." But my mind was restless, ping-ponging between past and present. I thought of Thanksgiving when I was 28, sitting at the kids' table because there wasn't a chair left even though I'd flown across the country to be there. I thought of Easter brunch when Mom passed me over in every photo, cropping me out until only Sophia's smile remained. I thought of birthdays forgotten, erased. And now this, the final insult, my own sister cutting me from her wedding, as if I'd never been part of her story. The sun dipped lower, painting the sea in gold. Daniel's hand found mine. His thumb traced soft circles, grounding me. "Let them live stream their fairy tale," he said. "We're living the real thing." Still, when the first notes of music floated through the live-streamed feed, I couldn't stop myself from tapping join. The screen filled with a shaky camera view, Sophia walking down the aisle, bouquet trembling in her hands, Jason grinning like he'd already won. My parents glowing, clapping, drinking in every second. I watched from half a world away, unseen, unwanted. But this time, something inside me was different. Because for the first time, I didn't feel like the outcast. I felt like the witness. The one person who knew the truth behind the perfect filters, who had warned them all and been dismissed. My absence wasn't weakness, it was prophecy. And as the ceremony carried on with vows echoing under string lights, I whispered to myself, "Enjoy it while you can. The curtain always falls." Daniel squeezed my hand, and I let the wine wash over my tongue, the Aegean waves crashing in the distance, and I realized the story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. And this time, I would not apologize for choosing silence. It was late in Denver when the first pieces of the puzzle fell into my lap. I had been working late at the office, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting against the glass window as snowflakes drifted outside. Daniel was asleep on the couch, his hand still resting on the book he'd been reading. I should have closed my own screen, crawled into bed, and let exhaustion win. But instead, a name caught my eye: Jason Cross. I wasn't looking for him. I had been digging into a client's marketing file, searching for competitive data. But there it was, bold as day, a registration tied to a shell company in Miami, an address listed as a warehouse that, according to Google Maps, had been empty for years. I frowned, clicked deeper, and the more I read, the colder my skin felt. Wire transfers in odd amounts, tax filings that didn't match any normal operation. Jason's name threaded between companies that looked like they'd been created just to funnel money from one empty box into another. I copied the files, saved the PDFs. My stomach turned as I remembered his smug smile at Thanksgiving the year before, the way he boasted about investments while avoiding every real question. "I know opportunities the market doesn't," he'd said with that gleam in his eye. Now I knew exactly what that meant. I picked up my phone, dialed my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice chipper. "Livy, everything okay, Mom?" I said, my voice tighter than I meant. "I found something about Jason. It's not good. He's tied to shell companies. There are filings and court records. I think no, I'm sure he's laundering money. And Mom, it's linked to drug trafficking cases." There was silence. Just long enough for me to hope she was processing that maybe this time she'd believe me. Then came the sigh. That familiar, sharp sigh. "Olivia, you've always been dramatic. I'm not making this up. I have the records." "You watch too many crime shows," she said, laughter in her tone like a knife. "Jason is successful. He's giving your sister a beautiful life. Don't ruin this." "Mom." But she was already moving in for the kill. "If you keep this up, if you keep trying to tear her down, you should probably stay away from the wedding. We don't need negativity there. Negativity. That was what she called it. Not a warning. Not protection. Just me once again being the problem. When I hung up, my hand was trembling. I thought maybe my father would hear me out. He'd always been stern but logical, so I called him. He chuckled after I explained everything. Liv, you've always thought you were smarter than everyone. Why don't you stop playing detective and let your sister enjoy her happiness? That word again. Happiness. Theirs. Never mine. I wasn't ready to give up. I called Sophia directly. She answered with music blaring in the background, laughter echoing around her. Hey sis, she said chipper, like we were still friends. For a moment I let myself believe. Sophia, I need you to listen. Jason isn't who you think he is. I found records, financial filings. She cut me off with a sharp laugh. Oh my God, you too. Mom already told me you were spinning stories. What is this, Olivia, some kind of jealousy thing? You can't stand that I'm finally happy. Her words burned. You think I'm jealous of a man who's about to drag you into prison. You don't know him like I do, she snapped. He's been nothing but good to me. You just want attention. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her see. But she was already crying, tears choking her voice. Why can't you just be happy for me? Why can't you stop trying to ruin everything? Then she hung up. The line went dead, but her words stayed echoing like a curse. I set the phone down and pressed my palms into my eyes until colors bloomed. I thought of every moment I had carried her when she wrecked my car in high school, and Dad blamed me for leaving the keys out. When she couldn't pay her rent and I sent half my savings. When she failed her job interview and I stayed up all night rewriting her resume. I was always the fixer, always the one who made things better. And yet here I was, cast as the villain. Daniel's voice pulled me back. Liv. He stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, holding 2 mugs of tea. His eyes scanned my face and he knew before I said a word. They didn't listen, did they? I shook my head. They told me to stay away from the wedding. That I was jealous, that I was ruining her happiness. He set the mugs down, crossed the room, and pulled me into his chest. Maybe it's time to stop trying to save them. The tears I had been holding back slipped free, soaking his shirt. But if I don't, who will? His hands pressed gently against my back. Sometimes the only way people learn is when no one saves them. You warned them. That's all you can do. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that my silence could be enough. But all I could see was Sophia's tear-streaked face, my mother's cold laughter, my father's dismissal. All I could feel was the weight of being cast out of the story I had always tried to hold together. Later that night, I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone. Sophia had posted an Instagram story, a whiteboard covered in rose gold marker. Guest list finalized. So grateful for all of you who will be part of our day. I zoomed in. Column after column of names, pastel flowers doodled in the corners. 152 names. Childhood friends. Old sorority sisters. Even Rachel Miller, the one who once whispered that I was too intense to be around. But not me. Not me. I almost laughed, because the alternative was falling into that familiar pit of disbelief. She hadn't just cut me. She'd cut me with precision, surgical and clean, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to erase me. Daniel came back into the room, sliding his phone into his pocket. I booked the flights, he said quietly. What flights to Greece? Elafonissi. You need air. You need peace. My heart stuttered. I can't just run away. He shook his head. You're not running. You're choosing yourself. For once. I stared at him, at the man who saw me when my own family refused to, and for the first time in years I let myself nod. Okay. He smiled, that soft, steady smile that always felt like an anchor. Good. Because you deserve more than being the family's punching bag. I exhaled long and shaky, the way you do when something finally cracks inside you. And though part of me still ached for my parents' approval, for Sophia's trust, for the illusion of a family that cared, another part of me whispered that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was right. Maybe the only way to survive was to let them face their own storm without me. So I closed my laptop, slid my phone into the nightstand, and climbed into bed. Daniel's hand found mine beneath the covers. "Let it go," he murmured. "They made their choice. Now make yours." And as I drifted to sleep, the last thought that crossed my mind was this: if the FBI already had their eyes on Jason, then it was only a matter of time before my family realized what I had tried to save them from. The only question was, would they survive the lesson? The phone wouldn't stop lighting up on the counter, glowing every few minutes with photos from my mother. Bouquets, Sophia in a veil at the fitting, Jason shaking hands with my father. They weren't messages meant for me, not really. They were broadcast proof of their picture-perfect happiness. Proof I wasn't part of it. I turned the phone face down, but even then I could feel the hum of it like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. When I finally gave in and checked Instagram, Sophia's story was at the top, framed in glittering rose gold letters. A boomerang of her twirling in a gown, captioned, "Can't wait to marry my forever, surrounded by love." I stared at those words until my throat burned. Surrounded by love. And yet the one person who had carried her through every crisis, every broken down night, had been deliberately cut out. I whispered to the empty room. "The people who love you, that's not me, is it?" Daniel appeared in the doorway, hair damp from the shower towel looped around his shoulders. He studied my face for a moment, then came and set a mug of tea beside me. "You don't have to punish yourself by looking," he said softly. "I can't help it," I admitted. "It's like pressing on a bruise. I already know it hurts, but I can't stop." He sat next to me on the couch, pulling one leg under him. "So what now? You going to keep trying to convince them?" I let out a hollow laugh. "Convince them of what? That I exist, that I matter. They've already decided. Mom said it herself, don't make it about me. Sophia said I was jealous. Dad thinks I'm just trying to ruin her happiness. If they want Jason, they can have him. But I won't sit in Denver next weekend refreshing social media like a ghost." Daniel reached for my hand, warm and steady. "Then let's go. Let's leave before their circus even starts. Greece, Elafonissi, salt water and silence." The idea startled me, almost too bold to hold on to. What if they say I'm selfish, that I abandoned them? He met my eyes. "Olivia, they already erased you. What you do now is yours. Stop living as though you need their permission to breathe." His words landed like stones in a pond, rippling through me. I thought of Christmas dinners, where my chair always seemed to slide further down the table of the year my birthday passed without so much as a text of Thanksgiving, when I, at 28 years old, was squeezed between cousins at the kids' table while Sophia sat proudly at the head. They'd been rewriting my place for years. Maybe I had been the only one pretending it wasn't deliberate. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, Denver's skyline was a scatter of gold against the dark. I could see the reflection of my own face in the glass, tired, older than 32, weighed down by years of being the responsible one. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe the only way to win this time is to walk away before I'm asked to carry the ruins again." Daniel came up behind me, resting his chin lightly on my shoulder. "I'll book the tickets tonight." The words felt like oxygen, both terrifying and freeing. I didn't argue. I didn't try to imagine how my parents would twist it. Instead, I imagined waking up to waves instead of voicemails, sun instead of guilt. The following days blurred into preparation. I folded sundresses I hadn't worn in years, slid sandals into the suitcase, tucked a book into the side pocket. Daniel, ever the planner, had already pulled up a villa on his laptop, whitewashed walls, a balcony, looking over pink sand. "It's ours," he said, like it was that simple. And maybe it was. The night before the flight, I sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at the calendar notification on my phone. Sophia and Jason wedding, all day. My thumb hovered, then pressed delete. The alert vanished with a tiny chime, and I exhaled so deeply it startled me. Daniel leaned in the doorway, watching. "That sounded like freedom. More like surrender," I said quietly. "Sometimes surrender is how you win," he countered. The next morning, we were at the airport before sunrise bags, rolling across polished floors, the smell of coffee and jet fuel heavy in the air. As we stood in the security line, Daniel's hand wrapped around mine, thumb tracing circles across my knuckles, grounding me in a way my own family never had. I glanced up at the departure board, saw our flight to Athens, and felt a pang of guilt stab through me. They would call me selfish. They would say I abandoned my sister. But hadn't they abandoned me first? On the plane, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass as Denver shrank beneath us, roads turning to threads, neighborhoods to grids. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "Let them drown in the story they wrote. I won't rescue them this time." Halfway across the Atlantic, Daniel leaned over with a grin, flipping through a travel magazine. Kayaking in Elafonissi, dinner at a cliffside taverna, pink sand beaches. We're going to do it all. I smiled back, a real smile for the first time in months. And I won't think about them. He kissed the top of my head. That's the plan. But when I dozed off against his shoulder, dreams carried me back, Sophia laughing as she blew out candles on a cake at 10 me, standing in the corner, my own birthday forgotten the month before. My father clinking glasses at Thanksgiving saying, "We're so proud of our Sophia." My mother wrapping an arm around her at Christmas while I cleared plates alone in the kitchen. I woke with a start, the captain's voice announcing our descent. Daniel squeezed my hand, misreading my expression. "Nervous, no," I said softly. "Relieved." When the wheels touched down and the cabin filled with applause, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't even revenge. It was simply the release of carrying a burden that was never mine. As we stepped out into the bright Cretan sun, the warmth kissed my skin in a way my family never had. The breeze carried the scent of salt and wildflowers. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the fixer, the forgotten, the excluded. I was just me. And as we drove toward Elafonissi, the sea flashing in and out of view, I thought of the words my mother had spat at me. "Don't make it about you." I smiled bitterly, leaning into Daniel's shoulder. This time I whispered, "It is about me." The air smelled of salt and thyme as the taxi wound its way along the coastal road, each curve opening into a new view of the Aegean, so dazzling it seemed painted. When the driver finally turned down a narrow lane lined with olive trees and stopped before a whitewashed villa perched above the sea, I felt like I had stumbled into another life. Daniel tipped the driver generously, grabbed our bags, and smiled at me like he had been planning this moment for months. "Welcome to Elafonissi," he said. The villa was simple but breathtaking, arched doorways, wooden shutters painted a soft blue, a balcony that opened directly onto the horizon where the sky and sea blended into one. Inside, sunlight spilled across terracotta floors, catching the edges of wicker chairs, and a small table already set with 2 glasses of wine and a bowl of olives. The scent of citrus drifted through open windows. I walked out to the balcony, hands resting on the railing, and felt the wind brush through my hair. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what my family was doing without me. I was thinking about what I could do for myself. Daniel came up behind me, slipping his arms around my waist. "This is where we start fresh," he whispered against my ear. I closed my eyes and let the words sink in. Start fresh. Away from the endless manipulation, the favoritism, the suffocating role of being the fixer. That evening we walked down to the beach. The sand truly shimmered pink in the fading light, mixing with gold as the sun slipped lower. Couples strolled barefoot, children chased waves, and the sea lapped gently at the shore as though it had no idea the rest of the world was in chaos. I let my feet sink into the cool sand, Daniel's hand warm in mine, and felt the weight of Denver, of my parents' cold voices, of Sophia's betrayal wash away with each step. Over dinner at a seaside taverna, we ordered grilled fish, lemon potatoes, and a carafe of white wine that tasted of flowers. Musicians played bouzouki under a string of lanterns, their melodies rising and falling with the breeze. Daniel lifted his glass. "To a wedding about love, not performance," he said. I laughed softly, clinking my glass against his. One day I said ours will be small, quiet. No audience, just us and the truth. But even in the glow of candlelight, part of me couldn't silence the memory of my mother's voice. Don't make it about you. That refrain followed me everywhere. I thought of the family dinners where Sophia was praised for the smallest accomplishments, while my achievements were dismissed, of birthdays where my name wasn't even mentioned, of every holiday when my chair was an afterthought. My family had been a stage, and Sophia had always been the star. I was background noise until I threatened their script by telling the truth about Jason. Back at the villa, I sat on the balcony and opened my phone. I told myself I would only check my email, maybe a message from a client. But there it was, at the top of my notifications: Sophia and Jason wedding. Live stream in 48 hours. My chest tightened as I opened it. A banner filled the screen: Sophia in Jason's arms, both beaming under fairy lights. The caption read, "Forever begins with family." Family. Daniel walked out with a plate of figs and cheese, caught the expression on my face, and set the plate down gently. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward him. He read the words, then shook his head with a low chuckle. "Sometimes forever ends faster than they think." I wanted to believe him, but the photo still gnawed at me. My parents looked so proud in every shot. They had chosen Jason as their golden boy, their savior. They had chosen him over me, over blood, over truth. Later that night, as I lay in bed listening to the waves outside, I thought about how different this world was from theirs. Here, no one demanded I play the role of fixer. No one dismissed me as dramatic, jealous, inconvenient. I was just Olivia, 32 years old, building a life with a man who saw me. I was visible not because I could be used, but because I existed. The following morning, Daniel suggested we rent kayaks. We paddled out into the crystalline waters, the sunlight refracting below us like liquid glass. Schools of fish darted around, and the cliffs rose behind us, dotted with wildflowers. Daniel laughed, splashing me, his voice echoing across the bay. For a moment, I laughed, too full and unguarded. This was what life was supposed to feel like: unburdened, unmeasured, free. When we returned to the villa, I felt lighter. But as I scrolled through my phone that evening, another notification pinged. Sophia had posted a countdown to the live stream, decorated with hearts and rings. "So grateful for everyone who will be part of our day," she wrote. I shut the phone off before I could fall into the spiral again. Daniel saw me tense and pulled me close. "Let them have their stage," he murmured. "We'll stay in the Sunday." I rested my head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and real. The sea whispered outside the air, smelled of wine and rosemary, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe him. But as the stars came out over Elafonissi, I couldn't shake the thought that in just 2 days my family would be gathered in Texas, under chandeliers and cameras, smiling as if none of it were rotten beneath. I had walked away, but I knew the storm was coming, and something deep inside me whispered, "I will see it. I will know when the curtain finally falls." The morning air was soft and salt-sweet when I opened my phone and saw the red banner slide across the top of the screen: "Sophia and Jason wedding is live now." I froze in the middle of the villa's kitchen, one hand still hovering over the coffee pot. 2 words pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. Live, now. Daniel came up behind me, still damp from his swim, a towel slung around his shoulders. He glanced at my phone. "You don't have to watch," he said gently. But my thumb was already hovering over the notification. "I need to see it," I whispered. "I need to see what I was cut out of." The feed opened to a shaky camera view. Someone's phone, maybe a cousin's. Rows of white chairs filled a lawn draped with flowers. A string quartet played something syrupy and familiar. Guests whispered excitedly. The altar was framed by archways of roses, a setting so curated it felt more like a stage than a wedding. And then Sophia appeared. She floated down the aisle in a gown that glimmered under the sunlight, her veil pinned perfectly, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The camera zoomed too close for a moment, catching her lips pressed into a nervous line. Around her, guests gasped in admiration, phones raised, clapping, smiling like they were all part of a fairy tale. I sat back on the couch in Elafonissi waves, crashing faintly in the distance, the glow of my phone screen cutting across the villa's white walls. I wasn't there, but somehow I was still inside it, watching invisible. Jason stood at the altar, his grin wide, almost too wide. He looked polished, perfectly tailored, every hair in place. But as the camera panned across him, I noticed his eyes darting to the back rows, then to a cluster of men in dark suits standing near the edge. They weren't relatives. They weren't guests. Their posture was too rigid, their eyes scanning the crowd. My chest tightened. Daniel noticed my expression. "What is it?" "Look at him," I said. "Look at those men behind him. Doesn't it seem wrong?" Daniel studied the screen, then gave a low hum. "Looks more like security detail than wedding guests." "Exactly." My throat constricted. Jason wasn't nervous because he was getting married. He was nervous because the walls around his perfect lie were already cracking. The camera shook as the officiant cleared his throat, beginning the ceremony. My parents came into frame, sitting front row, their faces glowing with pride. My mother leaned against my father's shoulder, her pearls glinting in the sunday. She looked radiant, as if this moment proved she had raised the perfect daughter with the perfect fiancé. I clenched my jaw. They never looked at me like that. Not when I graduated, not when I launched my company, not when I pulled myself out of the messes Sophia left behind. But here they were, their smiles brighter than I'd ever seen. All for him. Perfect, my mother's lips formed as she mouthed to a relative off camera. "He's perfect." Daniel slipped a cocktail into my hand, condensation dripping onto my skin. "Let them play their theater," he murmured. "We'll watch from paradise." I sipped the drink, the bitterness of gin and citrus filling my mouth, but it couldn't cut through the taste of bile rising in my throat. The officiant asked Jason to speak his vows. He laughed nervously, rubbed the back of his neck, and then launched into a speech about loyalty and family, about building a future with Sophia that would last forever. His words rang hollow to me like they had been memorized from a script. Sophia's turn came. Her voice quavered, tears brimming as she said, "Jason, you've shown me what real love looks like. You've given me a family that finally feels whole." The words stabbed. Given her a family. Hadn't she already had one? Or had I been erased so thoroughly that I didn't even count? Guests dabbed their eyes. My parents clasped hands, squeezing each other with satisfaction. And all I could think was, enjoy it while you can. Truth doesn't wait forever. The camera caught snippets of whispers in the crowd. Someone murmured, "Why so many guards?" Another voice hushed them. But the unease flickered in the air, a ripple just beneath the surface of the perfect picture. Daniel leaned closer. "You don't need to watch anymore," he said. "It'll only hurt." I shook my head. "No. I need to see this through. I need to witness how it all unravels." So I watched as Sophia slid a ring onto Jason's finger, her hand trembling slightly. I watched as they kissed to the sound of applause, guests cheering, phones snapping photos. The perfect illusion beamed live to hundreds of screens. Then, just as the officiant was closing his book, the feed jolted. A voice shouted from somewhere, out of frame, loud, commanding. The camera swung wildly as guests turned their heads. A woman screamed. The view blurred, shoes pounding against grass, the quartet breaking off mid-note. And then, clear as a bell, a man's voice thundered through the speakers. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are." The phone in my hand shook. Though it wasn't the camera, it was me. On screen, the camera tilted sharply downward, catching polished shoes, scattering women clutching their gowns as they ran, men shouting. My parents' faces flashed briefly, mouths wide in confusion and terror. Jason froze, his grin wiped clean, eyes wide like a trapped animal. Then men in black swarmed him, shoving him down, pinning him hard into the ground. Sophia's scream tore through the speakers, raw and jagged. The feed sputtered, froze for a second, then picked back up. Guests stampeded for the exits. The officiant stumbled back, dropping his notes. My mother clutched at her pearls. My father shouted something I couldn't make out. I couldn't breathe. My glass tipped, spilling cocktail across my lap, and I didn't even notice. Daniel's hand covered mine, steady, grounding. "Olivia," he whispered, "look at me." But I couldn't. I was locked on the screen, on the scene, unfolding a continent away. The dream they erased me from was crumbling in real time. The image stuttered again, pixelating. Then the camera was dropped, the view sideways against the grass. Voices shouted, boots pounded, someone sobbed. And then the feed cut to black. I sat frozen, my chest heaving, the sound of waves outside, colliding with the silence inside the villa. Daniel picked up my phone, wiped the drink from my hand, and asked quietly, "What just happened?" I swallowed hard, my voice barely audible. "The truth," I said. The screen blinked again, new notifications. Missed calls piling in, names flashing across the display. Mom, Dad, Sophia. Unknown numbers, each vibration a desperate knock from a world I'd finally stepped away from. Daniel's eyes found mine. "Are you going to answer?" I stared at the phone, the numbers climbing. 32 missed calls, then 34, then 36. "No," I said, finally, my throat dry, my voice steady. "Not this time." And I placed the phone face down on the table, the sea still roaring outside, knowing the story was only beginning. The screen flickered back to life with chaos. A guest's phone had gone live again, this time from somewhere near the back of the tent. The angle was shaky, running feet filling half the frame, but the words rang sharp and clear. Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Everyone stay where you are." Gasps rippled through the crowd, then screams, then the sound of chairs toppling. I clutched the edge of the table in the villa, the Mediterranean breeze forgotten, my whole body frozen as the scene unfolded. Jason was on the ground, 3 agents pressing him down, his wrists yanked behind his back. Sophia's veil had slid sideways, her face streaked with mascara, mouth open in a raw scream I'd never heard from her before. Guests scattered like birds startled from a tree. One of the agents lifted a folder toward the officiant. The camera caught it in passing, warrants stamped and signed. A voice boomed through the feed, charges of drug trafficking, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Subject is in custody. My father stumbled forward, red-faced. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "Do you know who we are? This is my daughter's wedding." Another agent shoved him back firmly. "Sir, stand down." Behind him, my mother clutched her clutch bag, fumbling with her phone. The camera zoomed briefly onto her screen, her online banking app. Her hand shook as she pressed refresh again and again, each time with the same result, balance 0. She gasped so loudly it cut through the screams. "Our savings, it's gone. All of it. Everything's gone." My father grabbed his own phone, typing furiously, only to freeze, staring at the same empty void. He roared, slamming his fist into a chair. "No, no, no." Sophia stumbled toward Jason, still screaming. "Jason, tell them. Tell them this isn't real." But Jason kept his eyes down, jaw tight, saying nothing as they cuffed him. He looked smaller. Suddenly, his expensive suit wrinkled, his slick hair disheveled. The prince they'd worshipped was gone. I sat in silence on the balcony, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Daniel leaned against the railing, his hand brushing mine. His voice was steady, grounding. "Olivia, you warned them." I nodded numbly, unable to tear my eyes from the scene. "They laughed at me. They called me jealous. Now they know," he said. The feed tilted as the guest ran, giving one last view of Sophia collapsing into my mother's arms, her veil torn, her bouquet scattered across the grass. Agents herded the guests toward the exits. The quartet's instruments lay abandoned, strings twanging as people tripped over them. Then the screen went black again. My phone buzzed violently against the table. I flipped it over. 6 missed calls from Mom. 4 from Dad. 2 from Sophia. Within seconds, the numbers climbed. 15, 19, 22. My throat went dry. Daniel took the phone from my hand before I could press anything. "Don't," he said firmly. I swallowed hard. She sounded so broken. "Olivia, if you answer, they'll pull you right back into it, into their mess, into their blame." But my chest ached as voicemail notifications poured in. I pressed play on the first. "Olivia, please," my mother sobbed. "They're saying it's all a fraud, that our accounts are frozen. You work with companies, you know people, you can fix this. Please come home." The next voicemail, my father's voice hoarse with rage. "This is your fault. You reported him, didn't you? You've ruined us. Answer me." Then Sophia's. Her voice was shredded, half sobs, half accusations. "Jason isn't a criminal. He's not, he can't be. They're lying. You've always hated me, you wanted this to happen. Please, Olivia, help me. Don't let them do this." The sound of her crying filled the quiet villa. I pressed stop, my hand shaking. Daniel sat across from me, his gaze steady. "Do you really think answering will change anything?" I shook my head slowly. "No, it won't change what's true." Outside, the sea crashed against the shore, steady and indifferent. I drew in a long breath. For years, I'd been the one to run toward their chaos, sending money, when Sophia maxed her cards, fixing her resumes, making excuses when she failed. I'd been the glue, the fixer, the invisible one they only noticed when I was useful. And now, when their perfect son-in-law turned out to be a criminal, when their savings evaporated, when their pride shattered, live on Facebook, they called me the daughter they had erased. The phone buzzed again. 32 missed calls. Then 38, then 41. My parents, my sister, relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Daniel reached over, touched my cheek. "You don't owe them anything." I blinked, tears hot in my eyes. "Then why does it hurt so much to ignore them?" "Because you still care," he said softly. "But caring doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to save people who threw you away." I covered my face, with my hands inhaling the scent of sea salt and jasmine drifting in from the balcony. I thought of the years I begged them to see me, the countless nights I cried into my pillow after being dismissed, the holidays where my chair was always an afterthought. And I thought of the one truth that had carried me all this way. I warned them. I warned them, and they laughed. When I lifted my head, I found Daniel watching me with quiet patience. I wiped my eyes, steadied my breath, and whispered, "This is justice. This is what revenge looks like." Silence. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. The phone vibrated again, numbers climbing. 49 missed calls, 55, 61. I reached for it, pressed the side button until the screen went black, and placed it face down on the table. The silence that followed was heavy, almost holy. We sat together in that silence, waves crashing in the distance, until I finally exhaled, my voice steady. "They wanted a picture-perfect family. Now the picture is shattered. Let them sit in the shards." Daniel pulled me close, pressing his lips against my temple. "And you," he murmured, "get to walk barefoot on pink sand instead." Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson. My phone lay dark on the table, buzzing faintly, every few minutes unheard. 96 missed calls. 96 unanswered chances. And, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for letting the phone keep ringing. By the time the sun began to sink behind the jagged cliffs of Elafonissi, my phone was a slab of glass possessed. It lit up every few seconds, buzzing across the wooden table like an insect desperate to escape. Missed call #7wo. Missed call #height 4. By the time I came back from rinsing sand off my feet, the number had climbed to 96. Daniel raised an eyebrow when he saw the screen. 96 missed calls, he said slowly. That has to be a record. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the glowing numbers, as if they might vanish if I willed it hard enough. They didn't. Instead, the phone vibrated again, buzzing insistently. I turned it over and saw my mother's name. Then my father's, then Sophia's, each one lined up like ghosts in the call log. Against my better judgment, I opened the voicemail box. The first message was my mother's voice, thin with hysteria. "Olivia, sweetheart, listen to me. Everything is gone. The accounts are frozen. We can't pay the mortgage, the catering, nothing. You have to help us. You're smart, you know how these things work. Please, baby, please." I shut my eyes, the words cutting in ways I didn't want them to. She had called me baby, a name I hadn't heard from her lips in years. Not when I called crying after college rejection, not when I lost my first job. Only now when her world collapsed. The next voicemail was my father, his voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "This is on you, Olivia. You called them, didn't you? You went to the FBI. Admit it. Admit you wanted to destroy us. You're selfish, ungrateful. Answer the damn phone." My throat tightened. I clicked to the next message. Sophia's voice came through, ragged, breathless. "Jason isn't a criminal. He loves me. They're framing him. I know you hate me, but don't let them do this. Please, Olivia. You're my sister. Don't let them take everything from me." Her sobs filled the tiny villa bedroom. I pressed the phone against my leg until the sound cut off. Daniel leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching me carefully. "And what do you hear?" in all that he asked. "Desperation," I whispered. "And blame." "Always blame?" He nodded. "Exactly. Not one sorry, not one admission that they were wrong. Just need expectation and anger." I stared at the phone, my reflection ghostly in the glass. 96 missed calls. For a split second, I imagined picking up, hearing their voices crack, demanding I come back, that I clean the wreckage. And then I imagined myself saying yes, like I had 1,000 times before. Sending money. Smoothing things over. Saving them. Again. But another voice in my mind was louder. "Fix everything. That's what you're for." I remembered Christmas dinner when I was 27. They'd posed for a family photo, everyone gathered around the tree, while I was still clearing plates in the kitchen. Later, when I asked why I wasn't in the picture, Mom shrugged. "You should have been faster." That photo still hung in their living room, Sophia glowing in the center, me erased. I remembered my 30th birthday, the one they forgot. I had sat alone in my Denver apartment eating takeout, waiting for the phone to ring. It never did. The next morning, Mom called, not to wish me happy belated, but to ask if I could wire Sophia money for a deposit. I remembered Thanksgiving when I was 28, shunted to the kids' table while Sophia sat at the head of the adults, beaming like a queen. Dad said, "It's just a seat, Olivia. Don't make it about you." And now, after cutting me from the wedding entirely, after calling me jealous and dramatic, they had the audacity to flood my phone with please, rage, and blame. Daniel crossed the room, gently pried the phone from my hands, and set it face down on the nightstand. "You don't owe them a single word," he said. I shook my head. "But they're my family." He cupped my chin until I met his eyes. "Family doesn't erase you when it's convenient. Family doesn't only remember you when they're drowning. These people, your parents, your sister, they trained you to believe you were only valuable if you fixed their mistakes. That isn't love, Liv. That's control." I swallowed hard, my chest aching. "If I stay silent, they'll say I abandoned them. They'll say I'm cruel." Daniel's voice softened. "Let them. Silence isn't cruelty. Sometimes silence is justice." I sat there for a long moment, listening to the faint sound of waves outside, to the steady rhythm of Daniel's breath. The phone buzzed again, insistent, but this time I didn't reach for it. Instead, I asked quietly, "Then this is revenge?" Just not answering. "It's not revenge," Daniel said. "It's reclaiming your life. Revenge is optional. Freedom isn't." I thought of Sophia's last voicemail, her sobs, her pleas. For a moment, guilt pierced me. She was still my sister. But then I remembered her words weeks ago, "Stay away from my wedding. You'll ruin everything." She had cut me out with a surgeon's precision, and now she was reaping the cost of that choice. The phone buzzed once more. 97, 98, 99. I drew in a long breath, picked it up one last time, stared at the number "Mom" again, and then pressed and held the side button until the screen went black. I set it back down, the silence that followed thick final. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for not rushing to rescue them. I felt steady. Daniel smiled, faintly kissed my temple. "That's my girl," he whispered. Outside, the Aegean rolled under the dusk sky, calm and endless. My phone lay dark on the nightstand, 96 missed calls locked inside, calls I would never return. I turned toward Daniel, whispered, "For the first time I get to choose me." And as the last light slipped over the horizon, I realized silence could be the loudest answer of all. The dawn in Elafonissi looked unreal, as though the sea had been painted fresh overnight. The sky was streaked with rose and gold, the shallow waves glowing a pale turquoise. I padded barefoot onto the balcony with a cup of thick Greek coffee, the scent rising in the cool air. For a brief, fragile moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that soaks into your bones and makes you believe peace is possible. Then my phone lit up on the table. Notifications stacked so fast, the screen looked like it might crack. Number "Heart-Wedding Meltdown" was trending. I scrolled with cautious fingers. Clips from the ceremony, Jason pinned to the ground, Sophia screaming in her ruined gown, my father shouting as agents shoved him back, were everywhere. TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. Each video captioned with brutal humor when the groom says, "I do" to the FBI instead. Tables turned live on Facebook. Comments poured in beneath them. "Didn't her sister warn them? This is karma served hot." Poor bride, but wow, should have listened. I sat back in the chair, the coffee cooling in my hands. My absence had become part of the story. Strangers, people I would never meet, were piecing together the truth that I had been erased to keep the fairy tale intact, that I had tried to warn them, and that the price of ignoring me had come due. Daniel slid open the balcony door, his hair mussed from sleep. "You're up early," he murmured. I turned the phone toward him. His brows lifted. "Already viral." "Already viral," I echoed. He came out, set a plate of warm bread and honey beside me, and kissed the top of my head. "Then let them be viral. We'll be alive." We spent the morning on the beach, renting kayaks that skimmed across water so clear we could see fish darting below. The sand shimmered pink under the sunshells, crunching softly as we pushed the kayaks back onto shore. I laughed when Daniel splashed me a sound so free it startled me. For the first time in years, I wasn't the family's shadow or their fixer. I was just Olivia, 32, on vacation with the man I loved, tasting salt on my lips. Later, at a seaside taverna, we shared grilled octopus and a bottle of white wine chilled with chunks of ice. Musicians strummed bouzouki, and the air was filled with laughter, chatter, the scent of lemon and garlic. It felt like the opposite of everything I'd left behind. No judgment, no manipulation, no silent resentment, just life, just joy. Still, when I checked my phone under the table, the storm was only getting worse. News sites had picked it up now. FBI raid interrupts Texas wedding. Groom charged with trafficking fraud. Family accounts drained in elaborate scheme. My parents' faces appeared in grainy screenshots, my mother clutching her chest, my father shouting with spit on his lips. Sophia mascara, smeared hands clawing at Jason as he was dragged away. Comments were merciless. This family ignored every red flag. The sister who warned them deserves a medal. Money, lies, and favoritism always rot from the inside. My throat tightened as I scrolled. It wasn't triumph I felt, not even satisfaction, just an odd, aching stillness. For so long, I had been the invisible one. Now millions of strangers were dissecting the drama that had defined my life. And they saw me, even if they didn't know my name. That night, we walked along the beach, barefoot, the moon painting silver streaks across the sea. Daniel stopped, looked out at the horizon, then at me. "You don't have to carry their noise anymore," he said. "I know," I whispered. And for once, I actually believed it. Back in the villa, I opened Instagram to post a photo of the sea pink sand glittering at dusk. When I clicked into my messages, hundreds of DMs spilled across the screen. Strangers writing, "Stay strong. I was cut out of my family too. You were right." Some were cruel, calling me jealous, blaming me for Jason's downfall, but most were full of a solidarity I had never expected. I scrolled until one name stopped me cold: Grandma Helen. Her message was simple. "Olivia, call me. There's something you need to know about the inheritance." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. Inheritance. My parents had always been secretive about my grandfather's estate. I'd been told casually that everything had gone to Mom and Aunt Caroline, that nothing was left for me. It had stung, but I swallowed it like I always did. Now, looking at that single line from my grandmother, I realized there had been another truth buried beneath the manipulation. Daniel looked up from pouring us glasses of wine. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward him. He read, his eyes narrowing. "Inheritance," I nodded slowly. "Something's been hidden. And I think I'm about to find out what." The sea roared outside, steady and endless. I set the phone down, palms damp, and whispered, "The tables haven't just turned, they're still turning." The night air in Elafonissi was heavy with the smell of seaweed and jasmine when I finally pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Grandma." My voice came out quieter than I meant, half afraid she wouldn't answer. Her voice, raspy but steady, filled the line. "Olivia, sweetheart, I wasn't sure you'd call. I almost didn't," I admitted, pacing the balcony with the waves whispering below. "But your message, inheritance, what did you mean?" There was a long pause, just the sound of her breathing. Then she said, "I should have told you years ago. Your grandfather made changes to his will before he passed. He named you the primary beneficiary." I froze, hand gripping the railing so tight my knuckles ached. "That's not possible. Mom said everything went to her and Aunt Caroline. That's what they wanted you to believe." Her voice cracked with age and something heavier, regret. "But the signed version, the final one, was filed with my attorney, Ava Monroe. It leaves you the Monterey mansion, the trust in Whitaker Holdings, and other assets he wanted only you to have." The words struck like waves against rock, relentless and impossible to ignore. Mansion, trust, assets, me. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the thundering there. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because your mother was in the room when he signed it," she whispered. "She knew. She told the rest of the family the older version was final, and She trailed off, her voice breaking. "I let her. I thought it would keep the family from tearing apart even more. I thought I was protecting you." My stomach twisted, not from shock but from recognition. Of course my mother had erased me, not just from weddings and dinners but from my grandfather's last wish. Favoritism wasn't an accident in my family. It was the foundation. "I can't believe this," I murmured. "Or maybe I can." They always had a way of rewriting me out of the story. Grandma sighed, the weight of years in that sound. "I saw you on the news, Olivia. I saw what happened at Sophia's wedding. I realized you've been carrying pain that was never yours to bear. I won't be silent anymore. Ava is filing to reinstate the true will. You'll hear from her soon." I pressed my forehead to the railing, tears stinging my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. When I hung up, I stayed on the balcony for a long time, the sea stretching dark and endless before me. Daniel came out quietly, setting a glass of water by my hand. "You look like you just saw a ghost." "Worse," I said, voice thick. "I just saw the truth." I told him everything about the hidden will, the mansion, the company shares. He listened without interruption, his face shifting only when I said my mother had been in the room when the will was signed. Then he shook his head, jaw tightening. "They erased you because they were afraid of you. Afraid of what you rightfully held. It wasn't neglect, it was theft." The word hit hard. Theft. They hadn't just overlooked me, they had stolen from me, my own blood. I stared out at the horizon, the water black under the moon. All this time I thought I was invisible because I wasn't enough. But I wasn't invisible at all. I was dangerous to their story. Daniel slipped his arm around my shoulders. And now the story belongs to you. I thought of my parents' faces in those viral clips, Mom sobbing into her empty banking app, Dad shouting at agents as Jason was dragged away. Their pride had shattered in public, their wealth evaporated, their perfect image torn apart. And beneath it all was another truth, waiting to surface. They had lied about the inheritance too. A laugh broke from my chest, sharp and humorless. They wanted everything. And now they have nothing. Daniel kissed my hair. That's karma. I shook my head slowly. That's justice. Inside the villa, my phone buzzed again, another voicemail from Mom, begging this time. I didn't move to answer. I let it ring until the sound blended with the waves. Later, lying in bed with the curtains open to the moonlight, I stared at the ceiling and thought of my grandfather. The way he used to press a peppermint into my hand after Sunday dinners, the way his eyes softened when I spoke, as though I wasn't too much, as though I was enough. He'd known, I realized. He'd seen the way they treated me, and he'd chosen me anyway. The thought brought tears that slipped silently into my pillow. Not from grief, not from anger, but from the strange relief of finally being seen, even if it took death and lawyers to make it undeniable. As I drifted towards sleep, the words from Grandma echoed in my head. Ava is filing to reinstate the true will. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't erasing myself to survive. The truth was stepping into the light on its own. And somewhere half a world away, my family was scrambling in the dark. The call came just after midnight, the villa wrapped in silence, except for the waves rolling against the rocks below. The screen glowed with no caller ID. Daniel stirred beside me, his arm heavy across my waist. Don't answer, he mumbled, but something in me needed to. My thumb hesitated, then pressed accept. All I heard at first was crying, jagged and wet. Then Sophia's voice cracked through the static. Olivia? Oh God. Olivia, everything is falling apart. I sat up slowly, slipping from the bed to the balcony. The sea was ink dark, the stars so sharp they looked like they could cut. Sophia, I said quietly, what do you want from me? Her sobs grew louder. Jason's in jail. The FBI, everyone's talking about me like I'm trash. The papers, the videos. Do you know what they're calling me, bride of a drug lord? Do you know what that feels like? I closed my eyes, the image of her in her wedding gown flashing in my mind, veil-torn mascara running. You married him, I said. I didn't know, she snapped, her voice rising. I didn't know he was doing any of this. Yes, you did, I whispered. I told you. I begged you to listen. Her breath hitched. If you hadn't spread those stories, if you hadn't tried to ruin things. My grip on the phone tightened. Are you blaming me for him being a criminal? You hated him from the start. You poisoned Mom and Dad against him. I almost laughed, the sound brittle. They were never poisoned against him. They worshipped him. They worshipped you. I was the only one who saw through it. She went silent, her breathing ragged. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then she whispered, small and cutting, You just can't stand that I had the spotlight. My throat closed, heat crawling up my neck. You think this is about jealousy, Sophia? Your husband laundered money and trafficked drugs. He drained our parents' accounts. And you want to talk about a spotlight? Her sobs broke again, louder this time. They're saying it's my fault, that I should have known. Jason's family won't talk to me. My friends won't pick up. Everyone's gone. I only have you. The words twisted like a knife. For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe her. Wanted to step into the role I'd always played, the fixer, the shield, the older sister who carried the weight. But then I remembered Christmas dinners when she was showered with gifts while mine sat unopened. Birthdays no one remembered for me, yet entire weekends planned for her. My parents' endless favoritism, the way they silenced me every time I tried to speak truth. You don't have me, I said finally. My voice didn't crack. Not this time. She inhaled sharply like I'd slapped her. So you'll just let your family fall apart. You'll just watch. They fell apart the day they erased me, I said. I just stopped picking up the pieces. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she hissed, bitter and venomous, "You'll regret this. When they all hate you for abandoning us, you'll regret it." "No," I said softly. "The only thing I regret is wasting so many years believing you'd ever choose me." And then I ended the call. My hands shook as I set the phone down, but my chest felt strangely light. The night air wrapped around me, cool and briny, carrying away the sound of her cries. For once I didn't feel like the villain. I felt free. Daniel came out sleepy-eyed, rubbing his face. Was it her yes? He wrapped his arms around me, kissed the top of my head. "Do you regret hanging up?" I shook my head. "Not at all." He studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Good. Because you don't need to be their savior anymore." I leaned into his chest, the sound of the waves steady beneath us. "I'm not their savior, not their scapegoat, not anything anymore." The phone buzzed again against the table, the glow of another call. I didn't even glance at it. I turned my back to the screen, let the sound fade into the night. Daniel held me tighter. "Then that's your answer." Silence. But just before we went back inside, another notification flashed across the screen, different this time. A voicemail from a number in California. I picked it up, glanced at it once, and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't Sophia. It was a law firm. Daniel caught the look on my face. "Who is it?" I showed him the screen. The name was Formal Clinical Ava Monroe, attorney at law. "She's my grandmother's lawyer," I said slowly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "And she says she has something for me." About the will. The waves crashed harder below, as though punctuating the moment. I turned the phone face down on the table, my pulse thundering. First the wedding, then the FBI. Now this an inheritance I had been told never existed. Daniel brushed my hair back from my face. "Looks like the real story is just beginning." I nodded, a sharp breath escaping my chest. "And this time it's mine to tell." The morning light spilled through the shutters when my phone rang again, this time with a number that didn't blink with desperation or rage. The screen read Ava Monroe, attorney at law. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Daniel, still half asleep, rubbed his eyes and said, "Answer it. This one matters." I pressed the green button. A calm, deliberate voice came through. "Miss Hart, this is Ava Monroe. I represent your grandmother, Helen Whitaker. I believe she spoke with you last night." "Yes," I breathed. "She said there was a will." "A different one." "That's correct," Ava said. "I'm calling to confirm. The last valid will and testament of your grandfather, James Whitaker, was signed and notarized in my office. In that document, he named you the primary beneficiary of his estate." The words landed like a thunderclap. I pressed a hand to my chest, staring out the balcony doors where the sea glittered pink and blue. "Primary beneficiary." "Yes," Ava continued smoothly. "That includes the Whitaker mansion in Santa Barbara, his personal trust, and controlling shares in Whitaker Holdings. Your mother and aunt presented an outdated version of the will after his death, but the signed final version is in our possession. We've already filed a motion to reinstate it with the Superior Court. You will be contacted about the proceedings." I gripped the edge of the bed, dizzy. Mansion, trust, company shares. All the things I'd been told didn't exist, all the things I was excluded from because my mother made sure of it. Daniel sat up beside me, listening with wide eyes. Ava's voice didn't falter. "Your mother was present when your grandfather signed the document. She is aware of its contents. Her actions to conceal this will are questionable, and we will be prepared to present evidence if she contests." It felt like the floor dropped from beneath me. For years I believed I was overlooked because I wasn't good enough. Now I knew the truth. I had been erased because I had too much. "Miss Monroe," I whispered. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Her tone softened just slightly. "Sometimes silence in families is more powerful than the truth. But silence doesn't hold in court. The truth will." When I hung up, my hands were trembling. Daniel took the phone from me gently and set it down. "So it's real," he said. "You're the heir." I nodded numbly. "And they knew." They all knew. Daniel pulled me against his chest, his heartbeat steady under my ear. They lied to you because the truth scared them. You were never invisible, Liv. You were a threat to their story. Tears stung my eyes. I thought of my mother's pearls at Christmas dinners, the way she'd beam at Sophia while barely glancing at me. I thought of my father's dismissive chuckles, the words "don't make it about you" echoing through my life. And I thought of Sophia's furious voice just nights ago, accusing me of jealousy while her husband was laundering money under her nose. All of it, every slight and cut, suddenly reframed by this truth. They hadn't just forgotten me, they'd stolen from me. I stood and walked to the balcony, letting the Aegean wind whip through my hair. Below, waves sparkled endless and calm. I warned them about Jason, I said softly. They didn't listen. I told them I was hurting. They laughed. And when Grandpa chose me, they buried it. They buried me. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. Not anymore. They can't bury the truth this time. We stood in silence, the weight of years pressing down, and then slowly lifting. Later that afternoon, I opened my laptop for the first time since arriving in Crete. Dozens of emails flooded the screen, reporters asking for statements, strangers writing to say they believed me, my parents' names dragged through headlines. And tucked between them were 2 messages from my mother. The first, "You need to come home. We can explain everything. Don't let outsiders ruin the family business." The second, "This isn't over. You owe us. Remember who raised you." The rage that rose inside me was sharp, but it burned out quickly, leaving only clarity. I clicked on the menu, hovered over her address, and pressed block sender. Daniel watched me from across the table. "You okay?" I met his eyes, steady for the first time in weeks. They erased me from their wedding. Now I erased them from my life. That night, as the sky bled orange into indigo, we walked along the shoreline. My feet sank into cool sand waves curling around my ankles. The sea felt endless, carrying away the last echoes of their control. I whispered to Daniel, "I don't need revenge. I don't even need their apology. The truth is enough." He squeezed my hand. "That's justice." And as we walked back toward the villa, the stars pricking alive overhead, I knew the tables had turned for good. This wasn't just about inheritance or money, or even the lies. It was about finally being free to write my own story. The fire crackled low on the beach, casting orange light across the pink sand that glowed faintly even in the dark. Daniel handed me a marshmallow skewered on a stick, the sugar crisping at the edges. I bit into it and let the sweetness melt on my tongue, staring out at the black horizon. For the first time in my life, I said softly, "I don't need them to hear me. My silence is enough." Daniel shifted closer, his arm warm against mine. Behind us, the villa lights gleamed, but here only the tide and the wind filled the spaces where voices used to live. My phone lay on the table above the dunes, screen lighting up every few minutes, buzzing with voicemails and texts I would never answer. Mom's messages had turned from pleading to furious. "You need to come home. You're destroying this family." Dad's were worse, full of blame. "You think you're better than us now. You'll regret this." And Sophia's, her sobs and half-hearted apologies, tangled with accusations, each one reminding me of the same truth. Nothing had changed. Not one of them had said the words that mattered. Not one of them had said, "I'm sorry, we were wrong." I let the phone buzz, let it scream into the void of the night, and turned back to the fire. "They trained me to believe love was fixing everything for them," I whispered. "That my value was in how useful I could be. But that's not love. That's control." Daniel reached for my hand, laced his fingers through mine. "And you don't have to play that role anymore." The flames popped, sparks rising into the wind. I thought of all the chairs at Christmas dinner where my seat had been forgotten, of birthdays, where my name never made it into the family group chat of the wedding guest list, where my name was crossed out like I'd never been born. Those erasures had carved holes in me for years. Tonight, those holes finally began to close. The next morning, the sea was calm as glass when I stood on the balcony. The air was still, the world hushed, I made coffee, added a slice of lime the way the locals did, and sipped slowly. My phone buzzed again, emails this time. Reporters, old classmates, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in decades. Most messages carried one theme: solidarity. I know what it's like to be cut out. Your story is mine too. Stay strong. One message stood apart. It was short from my cousin Tori, who had never joined the family circus. I'm proud of you. You don't owe anyone an explanation. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. I left it there, a single piece of proof that someone in the family had seen me all along. By noon, Ava Monroe had emailed again. The court date was set. The will was moving forward. My mother would have to stand in front of a judge and explain why she had hidden my grandfather's wishes. For once, her charm, her pearls, her careful manipulation wouldn't protect her. I read the email twice, then closed the laptop. I didn't feel giddy or vindicated. I just felt steady. The truth was finally walking on its own legs. I didn't have to drag it anymore. That evening, Daniel poured us glasses of wine, and we cooked dinner together: grilled fish, roasted vegetables, garlic spilling across the counter because I never measured. We laughed when the pan smoked, danced clumsily to music spilling from his phone. There was no audience, no stage, no spotlight. Just us, just peace. Later, we walked down the pier, the boards warm beneath our feet. The tide was pulling out the stars, bright enough to paint a path across the water. Daniel leaned on the railing, glanced at me. So what now? I took a long breath. Now I live. Without waiting for their approval, without hoping for their apologies. Just live. He smiled, that slow, steady smile that always felt like a promise. Good answer. Back at the villa, I set my phone down on the patio table and powered it off completely. No more buzzing, no more interruptions, just silence. 96 missed calls, and none of them would ever be returned. I stared at the dark screen and whispered, they erased me from their wedding. Now I erase them from my life. The next morning, I stood on the balcony with my journal open, the sea, a soft shimmer of silver and blue. I began to write, not for them, but for me. If you've ever been erased, overlooked, or told to stay small, remember this: silence can be power. Revenge doesn't always need fire. Sometimes it only needs distance. I paused, tapped the pen against the page, then smiled. Daniel came out with coffee, glanced at the words. That's not just for you, he said. That's for everyone who's ever felt invisible. I nodded, closing the journal gently. He was right. That night, as we sat together on the beach, I turned to Daniel, my voice low but firm. They had 96 chances to hear me. Now they'll only hear silence. The waves whispered in agreement, and the firelight danced across his face. For once I felt whole. Not angry, not bitter, just whole. And if you're listening to this story, if you've ever been the one left out, the one erased, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story. Leave a comment. Share it. Let your voice take up space where someone tried to shrink it. And if you want more stories like this, about justice, about karma, about the tables finally turning, make sure you like and subscribe. Because silence can be powerful, but telling your truth out loud can be too.